What happens when the potential harms of a medical experiment are not conveyed to its subjects? Is there a social moral responsibility to provide healthcare to all? And what does it mean to die with dignity? What are the conflicting social values and personal beliefs around such a practice? My name is Melissa Karen. I'm the director of the Mudd Center for Ethics at Washington and Lee University, and these are some of the questions we will think through together during our year-long program entitled How We Live and Die: Stories, Values, and Communities. The program, full of lectures, a panel discussion, and a multimedia art exhibition, effectively combines the scope and depth of both the humanities and sciences to address the most pressing issues of medical ethics today. So what is this field of medical ethics? There are four main pillars of medical ethics, and these are generally autonomy, giving the patient agency and information to choose freely; beneficence, doing good; non-maleficence, committing to non-harm; and justice, ensuring equity and fairness in care. The premise for this four-principled oath is based, in part, on the Hippocratic Oath, named after Hippocrates, the Greek physician of the 5th through 4th centuries BCE, who may have been the original author of the oath that outlines moral behavior and expectations of a physician. While the current bioethics or medical ethics principles just outlined are informed by ancient Greek medical ideals. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us on this very beautiful afternoon. My name is Melissa Karen. Sorry, I should probably project a little bit more. I'm the director of the Mudd Center for Ethics, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this inaugural event of the Leadership Lab, something that we just began to think about and initiated. This will be our inaugural event. And it is noteworthy to start this event reflecting on Roger Mudd's gift that he gave us 15 years ago. So in 2010, he helped with actually Ken Ruscio, who was the president of W&L at the time. They worked together to create the Mudd Center for Ethics. And at the time of its founding, Roger Mudd, who was an alum here and went on to be a highly esteemed journalist, as I think many of you know. At the time he made the gift, he said, and I quote, "Given the state of ethics and our current culture, this seems a fitting time to endow a center for the study of ethics, and my university is its fitting home." I reiterate these words now as the Mudd Center launches this new endeavor, an initiative devoted to fostering thoughtful and rigorous inquiry into the characteristics of ethical and responsible leadership across disciplines and professions in our globalized world. Indeed, this seems like a fitting time to commence and nurture such inquiry that will serve as a touchstone for ethical leadership, so that its defining qualities are never so far from our hearts or minds. When we considered who would be an appropriate and powerful voice to launch this new initiative, Ken Ruscio was close to all of our minds, in fact. Came to my mind, and then several others approached me when I was in that thinking stage and wondering how this might take form and who we might ask. Ken received his MPA and PhD from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. His scholarship and teaching have focused on democratic theory, political leadership, trust, and public policy. Many of you already know Ken, as I said. He was the president of Washington and Lee University from 2006 to 2016. The Board of Trustees recognized Ken's decade of leadership by naming the Ruscio Center for Global Learning in his honor. Ever dedicated to higher education, Ken currently serves on the board of Skidmore College, and our previous provost, Mark Connor, is now the president there in New York. the Center of Politics at the University of Virginia, and the Collegiate School in Richmond. And while all of those things make him a fantastic person to launch this series, for me there is something a little bit more and a little more personal. I remembered Ken's commencement speech of 2016, which would be his last year at WNL. I wrote Ken shortly after his speech, thanking him for not skirting the thorny political issues of the day and what felt like a moral crisis looming. Indeed, in 2016, he presciently and kindly encouraged our soon-to-be graduates with the following words. Remember those habits of the heart you acquired. Practice the habits of the mind you've developed. Don't succumb to the cynicism and meanness of the age in which we find ourselves. Don't seek refuge from a complex world in the safe harbors of simplicity and slogans. Act with dignity, decency, and civility. Become known as the Washington and Lee woman or man who offers reasonable and reasoned positions in the midst of chaos. And most of all, be someone who cares. Be someone who cares about others more than yourself. When I read those words now, the same words that moved me over almost 10 years ago, I can't help but hear the power of humility and kindness in those lines. What is it to be informed and led by deep intelligence, but also humility, hope, and empathy? For me, his words served as an example of ethical leadership then and now. And I couldn't be happier or more moved, frankly, to invite Ken Ruscio to speak on this subject today. So please join me in welcoming Ken back to Washington.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, and thanks to all of you who are coming. This is a little bit awkward at the moment, since I'd planned just to give my commencement speech from 2016. But I'm pretty good at ad-libbing, so although some of those same themes will come out. But Melissa, thank you very much, and to everyone at the Mudd Center for the invitation and to be here. It's great to be back. There are so many familiar faces here today, so many new faces, so many new buildings on campus. I was walking around this morning, and there's this big building on Washington Street and I was looking around the corner to see if I could find Baker and Davis Halls, and they're just gone. I don't know what happened. It's disconcerting in a way, because when I come back, I always have this feeling that people are looking my way and saying, forgotten but not gone. I was, a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned to a few of you, I gave a talk at the St. John's Historic Church in Richmond. And that is the site where almost exactly 250 years ago, Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And so they have kind of a series of events commemorating that. And so I was giving a talk as part of that. And the person who was introducing and welcoming everybody to the event, he was the head of the foundation, and he said, we have two basic missions at the foundation. One is education, and the other is historic preservation. And I'm sitting there kind of squirming, thinking, a few years ago I would have been very confident that I'd been invited to pursue the mission of education, but now wondered if my presence at the podium was an act of historic preservation on their part. It is, and when you get to my career stage, you do get a little reflective. And one of the things that I find myself reflecting on is the importance of stories that get passed through generations and preserving those stories. And it's not just to tell the stories about the details of our past and preserve those, but to tell about the values and the principles that underlie our institutions. And here at W&L, our stories often center around the people. We have a very complex history, a very deep history, and it's sometimes hard to tell the values and principles just in abstract ways. So we reflect upon the people who have influenced this place, taught in our classrooms, supported our endeavors, and otherwise made us who we are today. We're here today in the Hart Center. And Houston Hart was this wonderful former trustee, alumnus, and whenever we were down in his neck of the woods, and it was a pretty big neck of the woods in Texas, we would always stop by. And he was in his advanced years at that point, kind of hard of hearing. And the purpose was to let him know we hadn't forgotten him. It was also, frankly, to be sure he hadn't forgotten us, and he didn't. And witness what we have here today. We're in the Leyburn Library, named after James Leyburn. And he had retired by the time I came here as a student, but he was still giving the first year orientation talk in the chapel. And here's what I remember about that. As an 18-year-old first-year student, it was our second day on campus. We were marched over to the chapel, and our RA said to us, "This gets a standing ovation." And it was kind of obligatory. We had no idea what he was going to say. And I'm sure what he said was very impressive and deserving of a standing ovation. But the pressure that was on us as a first-year student to conform to that, and we did. We gave him a great standing ovation. But he is much more than that. He had a great impact. And I can't let the afternoon go by without saying a word about Roger Mudd. He, in all seriousness, is, as I said last night at dinner, not just an alumnus who I admire greatly, but an individual who I've known, who I knew throughout his life, who I just admire tremendously. Very professional, a person of great integrity, all kinds of awards in journalism, all kinds of memorable events that he was present at and he tells about. It was just an honor and privilege. As Will knows, one of the great privileges of this position is to meet some very distinguished, impressive people. And he was maybe at the top of the list for me. This center was so meaningful to him for all the reasons that Melissa said from that quote that he gave. He attributes the integrity that he got in his career from the education he received at Washington and Lee. And it was so important for him to give that back so that future generations could benefit from that. The center today, he's looking down saying, this is it. This is exactly what we were thinking about. With one exception. He did press me fairly often in the discussions about, can't we have a required course in ethics for all students? And I said, Roger, if it was up to me, of course. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But the faculty. And he said, okay, I get it. But, again, as I said at dinner last night, had I known about executive orders, I could have, I would have really jumped on the opportunity. So, Will, you now have that I just never had, so go with. So Roger's looking down right now. He's saying, Ruscio, get on with it. So let's get on with it. And with apologies for that long introduction. E.B. White was an essayist for The New Yorker, and probably best known as the author of that children's book, Charlotte's Web. During World War II, there was an entity called the Writers' Board in what was then the War Department, now known as the Defense Department. And they embarked on a project to define democracy. And they solicited the help of a great number of prominent thinkers, and E.B. White was one of them. And here's how he responded. Surely the board knows what democracy is. It is the line that forms on the right. It is the don't and don't shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It is the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. It is the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the ration coffee. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of a morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. The case I want to make this afternoon is that while democracy requires strong institutions and intricate procedures to ensure fairness and accountability, it also requires something else, a spirit among its citizens and leaders, a temperament, a set of virtues, and something we used to be quite comfortable calling character. The assertion is driven by two concerns on my mind these days. One is that the current debates over the state of our governance have us focusing on the procedures of democracy. The extent to which various actions by our political leaders push the boundaries of their authorities, the role of courts and judges, the relationship between Congress and the executive, the propriety of emergency powers and executive orders. It's about the rule book, the laws, the Constitution, and the structure of institutions. Lawyers are earning their keep, and it's no surprise applications to law school are way up. I get it. Those are extremely important matters, and in a world of confusion, disruption, and complexity, such matters, complex as they can be, are easier to grasp and to litigate. But they crowd out considerations of our national temperament and disposition. That's what I want to focus on, not to diminish the emphasis on procedures and institutions, but just to be sure they don't get lost in the scheme of things. A house is about its architecture and its engineering, but a home is defined by the people who live there. I'm looking at the home side of democracy today and leadership, leaving the architecture discussion for another time and place. The other concern driving my thoughts is what I would call the political coming of age theory that I have on the back of an envelope somewhere. Napoleon was purportedly said that if you want to know how someone thinks, look at what was happening in the world when they were 20. And I truly believe that, and I speak somewhat from personal experience, but when I think about how students then and today go through their political coming of age, they come into college kind of aware of what's out there in the world, but the point at which they truly become engaged in those issues happens most often, not always, during their 4 years as undergraduates. And it forms a prism for them through which they view politics and leadership for the rest of their lives. It doesn't determine if they're liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican. It just forms that frame that how they think about politics and how they think about leadership for the rest of their lives. For me, I'm dating myself, I was here during the end of the Vietnam War and Watergate. And to this day, I think of leadership in America through the prism of what those debates were at that time. Very different debates now, but the principles and the way you think about it. So the concern part. There are plenty of data showing how our youth have minimal trust in our institutions and even democracy itself. They have little confidence that they will be better off than their parents' generation. They believe little of what they hear from established sources of information. I'm not so naive or nostalgic to imagine there ever was a golden age of political discourse and perfectly enlightened leadership. But I've never seen anything like this. It is a time when the models of leadership on display are deeply out of alignment with the character of democracy. And I worry that this student generation will think this is the way we do politics, and this is what leadership is. And so part of my message today, especially to the students, is that it doesn't have to be like this. That's a pretty big thesis with a lot of permutations, so I'm just going to illustrate it with two examples. Trust and humility. So first, trust. By the way, there are going to be a lot of W&L stories interwoven through here. I just can't help myself. So years ago, when I was a young faculty member, I also held the title of Dean of Freshmen. And for better or worse, that led to a lot of conversations with the then president, John Wilson. And in one of those conversations, he went off on a tirade about leadership. And the basic part of it was that you can't determine what good leadership is ahead of time. It's only in hindsight. And that's because good leaders have no common defining quality to them. They can be introverts, extroverts, activists, whatever. You can only tell in hindsight. No common quality. And then he paused and he said, except for one thing. All good leaders can be trusted. And that conversation occurred when I was thinking deeply about democratic leadership as a faculty member, and during a period when trust in our institutions and leaders was declining. President Wilson's comments set me on a course of study for a few years, asking why trust mattered in democracy. Sparing you the details of that long journey, it all came down to a really basic conclusion, almost self-evident. It is better to have leaders you trust than mistrust. And it is better to live in a society of high trust among its citizens than one where no one trusts each other. But what exactly determines our trust in leaders? 3 factors. Competence is one. Do we believe that leaders can actually do the job that they're assigned? Another is integrity and honesty. Do we believe what they are telling us, including their willingness to tell us things we don't necessarily want to hear? And finally, our confidence that they understand our concerns. Are they in it for their own good or for ours? And for the moment, I'm going to leave it to your thoughts how those conditions apply in the present environment. But what about the general level of trust in society, the trust that we have among ourselves and our daily interactions with each other? It is in a dismal state these days, in part because of the divisiveness within our nation, a divisiveness which seems not an unfortunate byproduct of whatever dynamics are driving our relationships, but rather an intentional strategy. Blaming others, especially those who are different than we are, for the problems we face will of course lead to mistrust. Leaders can exploit differences, or they can look for common ground, for shared values amidst different opinions. The latter approach is harder, but leads to a better place. The former approach is the path of least resistance, but that leads to a harsher, crueler place. Another quick W&L story. So in the midst of thinking about all this, about trust, I opened the Ring Tum Phi one day. And there's a long essay by the editor of the Ring Tum Phi. And she wanted to tell the story of how she made a decision. And the decision was this. She was given a take-home exam, along with the other students in the class, with the only instructions being that you could take it at any time, so long as you did not look at your notes and books while you were doing it. So, as she said, at 2 a.m., kind of standard time for students to take an exam, she set her books and notes aside and decided to plunge in. and you know where this is going. She got to one of those questions where she was stumped, totally stumped, and she knew that the answer was an arm's length away. And she said, I can't, there was no chance she would get caught. That was not the deterrent. She was in her room, the door was locked, it was 2 a.m. No chance she would get caught. It was just right there waiting for her to open and copy right in. She said, I can't do it. And then, so the rest of the essay was, what made her make that decision? And she very thoughtfully said, I had committed to a community where I wanted people to trust me. And I felt the obligation that I had was to make sure that I did things where they could, their trust in me was warranted. And the only way I could think about it, it was a moment, a fleeting moment of self-interest, overridden by a deeper obligation to what the community she belonged to stood for. The Ring Tum Fi's editor's decision to honor her community, to feel the weight of duty to others, is a close-to-home example of what I'm talking about, of trust in those around us. It's simply better to live in a community of trust than one of mistrust. But creating those communities of trust depends upon finding shared commitments that bind us to each other, whatever differences might otherwise divide us. Humility. Trust is a topic from the past for me. Humility is front and center right now. And that's because of important lessons I learned while I served as president of W&L, but also because as a student of democracy, I found, some interesting questions to explore lately. First, the humility lesson I learned as president. There were several, but I'm just going to give you one. It was right around this time in the spring semester when the calendar fills with a number of events. There's alumni weekends and commencements and board meetings and everything. And one evening, Kim and I hosted a reception at the president's house for those returning for their 50th class reunion. I used to make fun of them in their golf carts. Next year, you all can make fun of me. So we hosted this reception for them, and they were having a great time, catching up with each other, telling highly exaggerated tales of their time as students, protected by the statute of limitations, they were assured, and talking about their lives to each other, catching up with each other. And later in the chapel, I talked to them and asked them to think back on their graduation and the values that they had acquired during their time at W&L and the influence their alma mater had had on their lives. The very next morning, in an event that the scheduling gods couldn't have scripted any better, I met with about 100 students and their families for Admitted Students Day. And it was my job to convince them that W&L was the institution that they should choose. They hadn't yet made up their mind. This was the big last sale on it. And in trying to convince them of that, I said, the choice that you are about to make is not about the next 4 years. It's about joining a community that you will be a part of for the rest of your lives, and one that has been around for a very long time and will still be here when you return, like these other alumni, for their 50th reunion. I suddenly found myself, walking out of the chapel after speaking to them, smack in the middle of a century of the university's history, looking back with alumni on lives well lived, thinking about how the institution had influenced them, and then looking forward, imagining 50 years from now what those 18-year-olds would come back with, having accomplished during their time. Towards the end of his presidency, Barack Obama became reflective, especially about history and taking the long view. He realized that as president, you are essentially a relay swimmer in a river full of rapids, and that river is history. You don't start with a clean slate. and the things you start may not come to fruition on your timetable, but you can move things forward. And he went on to explain, we are born into this world and inherit all the grudges and rivalries and hatreds and sins of the past. But we also inherit the beauty and the joy and the goodness of our forebears. And we're on this planet a pretty short period of time so that we cannot remake the world entirely during this little stretch that we have. But our decisions matter, he said. And I think America was very lucky that Abraham Lincoln was president when he was president. If he hadn't been, the course of history would be very different. But I also think that despite being the greatest president in our history, it took another 150 years before African Americans had anything approaching formal equality, much less real equality. That doesn't diminish Lincoln's achievements, but it acknowledges that at the end of the day, we're part of a long-running story. We just try to get our paragraph right. In a similar way, I became sensitive at W&L to a kind of intergenerational contract, and it's one that applies to us as citizens of this country as well. Those of us here today benefit from the sacrifices of those who came before us, and we can freely enjoy those benefits if, but only if, we sacrifice equally for those still to come. Our inheritance makes us humble, but we are humbled even more by the duty it imposes upon us. We need to get our paragraph right, which is no small task, but it is just a paragraph. It was an important lesson in humility. But I had other reasons for thinking about humility. When I stepped down as W&L's president in 2017, beginning of 2017, a new president of the United States had just taken office. And for a student of democratic leadership, a natural experiment was about to take place. I wanted to, as a student of democratic leadership, I wanted to take a detached view of this. Throwing things at the television was not going to be a productive response. So I truly wanted to step back and think analytically and carefully about this. And humility became a focus. Because whatever you think of Trump politically, morally, ethically, legally, economically, or policy-wise, one thing we can all agree on is that humility is just not part of the profile. But my investigation was really not about Trump, but rather about a question raised by his presidency. Does humility matter in a democracy? Why or why not? A lot has gone into it. You're not going to get all of this. So I want to hit just a few highlights here. And one is George Washington's farewell address. You're probably very familiar with it. It's full, eerily prescient about the kinds of things that our democracy, or any democracy, is going to face. Dangers of partisanship, fiscal discipline or lack thereof, our role in international politics, why education is important in a democracy, the role of religion in a democracy. All of those things and many, many more, the list goes on. And by the time you got to the end of it, you probably felt you had done a pretty good day's work. But for me, the conclusion is the most remarkable part. Here is how Washington ended his public career, his life. Washington, head of the forces, revolutionary forces, chair of the Constitutional Convention, and our first president. His last public words. Though I am unconscious of intentional error, I'm nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I've committed many errors. Whatever they may be, I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which they may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of my incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as I myself must be to the mansions of rest. Incredibly, given his achievements, Washington ended his public life with an apology for his mistakes and a plea for forgiveness. On March 4th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated as the third president of the United States. It was a very awkward affair. John Adams, the incumbent and losing candidate, was embittered so much so that he refused to attend the inauguration of his successor. The only time in our history that occurred until, Jefferson offered a nod to unity. This was the address in which he famously said, think about this for a second, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. But as with Washington's farewell address, something other than the most well-known parts caught my attention. Rather than waiting until the end of his presidency to apologize for his mistakes, Jefferson began it that way. As he assumed the nation's highest office, he confessed the task is above my talents. He couldn't reconcile the greatness of his charge and the weakness of my power. He did not say, I alone can fix this. On the contrary, he reached out for help from the other high authorities provided by our Constitution. He faced the sad reality that it will rarely fall to the lot of imperfect men to retire from the station with the reputation and the favor which will bring him into it. He expressed humility. I shall often go wrong through defective judgment, and I ask indulgence for my own errors, which will never be intentional, and your support against the error of others. In their two historic addresses, Washington and Jefferson were telling us something about themselves, but also something about our democracy. And I think it was this. The enduring strength of American democracy depends on the character of its people and its leaders. Maybe it's the mustard on the hot dog, the don't and don't shove, or the line forming to the right. It's very hard to define, but spirit comes as close as any word that I can think of that capture the meaning. An intangible feature of society that makes it possible for people of different faiths, beliefs, values, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences to live together respectfully, decently, and civilly. This is not a new revelation, but I think it's been forgotten lately. One reminder comes from revisiting James Madison in the Federalist Papers. To be sure, he was not naive or Pollyannish about human nature. On the contrary, he worried about selfishness, factions, ambition, and unchecked power. He especially worried about our propensity to let emotions overwhelm reason and how democracy could inflame rather than temper those passions. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, he said, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. But a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, one based on self-governance, couldn't rest only on such a dire view. And so he said this: as there is a degree of depravity in mankind, which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher proportion than any other form. And I would say humility is one of the most essential of those other qualities. And why? In 1944, the distinguished jurist Learned Hand was invited to speak to a group of newly naturalized American citizens in Central Park, New York. After remarks from the mayor and others, Judge Hand took to the podium. Now, as a judge, he might well have talked about Civics 101, the courts, trial by jury, what judges do, obedience to the law, all of that. Instead, he spoke about liberty, or more to the point, the spirit of liberty. We have gathered here, he noted, to affirm a faith, this to the new American citizens, to affirm a faith in a common purpose, a common conviction, and a common devotion. And he continued, what then is the spirit of liberty? He said, I cannot define it. I can only tell you my own faith. The spirit of liberty is the spirit that it is not too sure it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interest alongside our own without bias. I would put it this way. A democracy is just not a comfortable place for those never in doubt, for those who seek to prevail rather than persuade, for those who demand to be heard without being prepared to listen, for those who seek easy answers to complex problems. It is, however, a place precisely for those who can blend the courage of their convictions with an eagerness to understand the hearts and minds of other men and women. Life in a democratic society, as a citizen or leader, requires humility. A final word. I worry a great deal about the model of leadership currently on display in our society. It is cynical rather than skeptical. It is emotional and impulsive rather than reasoned and restrained. It thrives on appeals to our differences rather than what we have in common. It privileges certitude, as if sounding sure of yourself is more important than actually being sure of yourself. It makes no gesture to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, but instead assumes an inherent selfishness. It doesn't lift us up, it drags us down. One commentator has written that we have entered an age of arrogance, and that sounds right, actually. If we live in an age of arrogance, though, it may be because we also live in an age of complexity and uncertainty. That breeds anxiety, which itself breeds a longing for simplification, which itself breeds a temptation to meekly follow those who claim they alone can fix it, who offer easy explanations and painless solutions for complex problems. This is a time when a posture of brook no doubt hardens into the tactic of accept no compromise. And many of us find ourselves drifting to the sidelines as passive spectators, unable to find purchase in the divisive debates and performative politics of our time. Maybe we all could use a little more humility and trust in our private lives, but I'm convinced we certainly need more in our civic lives, for they are the gateways to many other qualities we desperately need in a democracy if it is to survive. Magnanimity, grace, reverence, empathy, and civility, or Lincoln's better angels of our nature. Madison was right. Republican government presupposes the existence of those qualities more than any other form of government. I've always been an impassioned advocate for students entering politics and public service, and I still am. But it's getting complicated. There are days when I think that those now most attracted to that realm are the ones I'd least like to see pursue it. And those most repelled by it are precisely the ones I'd most like to see them pursue it. To restore my faith, I often revisit the essays by Václav Havel, the writer who years ago resisted communist rule in Czechoslovakia and later found himself president of its emerging democracy. It is ironic that someone raised in a communist regime became one of the most eloquent explainers of good democratic leadership. He pushed back against the idea, you guys are going to join politics, though, I know. I know you have another class, I know. But just remember, you guys get into politics. So to restore my faith, I often revisit those essays by Václav Havel, and he was the one who helped Czechoslovakia move from communist rule to democratic rule, and became one of the most eloquent explainers of good democratic leadership, ironically. He pushed back against the idea that to be a leader, especially a political leader, you have to be a jerk. Though his words were written for a different time and place, they are especially worth recalling today. If your heart is in the right place and you have good taste, Not only will you pass muster in politics, you are destined for it. If you are modest and do not lust after power, not only are you suited to politics, you absolutely belong there. It is not true that a person of principle does not belong in politics. It is enough for his principles to be leavened with patience, deliberation, a sense of proportion, and an understanding of others. It is not true that only the unfeeling cynic, the vain, the brash, and the vulgar can succeed in politics. Such people, it is true, are drawn to politics, but in the end, decorum and good taste always count for more. And to sum up Havel's approach, there is only one way to strive for decency, reason, responsibility, sincerity, civility, and tolerance, and that is decently, reasonably, responsibly, sincerely, civilly, and tolerantly. I've always thought W&L offered an education that provided its graduates with the capacity for not just leadership, but a particular kind of leadership, one marked by a sense of duty and self-sacrifice, concern for others, gratitude for all we have inherited, of course, but an even deeper obligation to the future and those who will follow us. It is an aspiration on our part, and one not met by any of us with any pretense of perfection. But on its best days, this community conveys a sensibility, an awareness of the importance of being in a community where people truly care about each other. I'd hate to think that this spirit will wither in the face of what we see beyond our campus. I hope that we will not be afraid to speak out, of course, but even more important, I hope we act with dignity, decency, humility, trusting others, and generating trust for ourselves. Thank you very much for your attention. You all will think I know you all are leaving, not standing in front of this. Where's the door? So look, Melissa, I guess, let me put it this way. I mean, this is the point at which the speaker says, if you have any questions, but let's broaden that to, sure, if you have any questions, that's great. But you all have thought about this as much as I have. So I want you to feel free to offer your additions, amendments. Remember, I said the spirit of liberty is the spirit which is to think that you're not so sure you have it right. So I would be the first to say that. So what sort of, we have a few minutes. Yeah.
I think one thing that democracy presupposes is that the leaders will follow the rules. Because it is the rules that really are the foundation of democracy. That's disappearing. And there's really not a good path back. Because once a rule is broken, it's really not a rule anymore. So I want you to comment on that.
Yeah. Well, I would, and again, would offer any others. That goes back to what I think I was alluding to at the beginning, that I think a lot about what the rules are. And I think a lot about how those rules are not separate from values. I mean, they are in the place because they seek to promote certain values of process, fairness, due process. All of those things are very, very important. But I think I've also come to realize in the last few years that in the absence of a commitment on the part of leaders to fundamental norms and fundamental ways of behaving, there are always going to be ways to press the boundaries of whatever those rules say. And there's often a lot of room in those rules for interpretation. One of the things that I left out, you'll be happy to know, is John Locke. John Locke, of course, was an early philosopher of liberalism. And what Locke said after laying out all of these rules of democracy and accountability and fairness. He said, but there are going to be times when the rules don't apply to the situation, and there has to be room for discretion. And he called it prerogative. And I thought about that a lot, and I said, well, what determines the zone of discretion? How narrow is it for some leaders, and how broad is it for others? And it depends on the amount of trust we give them. Those with a higher degree of trust have much more room to maneuver in those very unpredictable situations. Those with low degree of trust are going to be hemmed in when it comes time for those kinds of emergencies. So I am absolutely, we should play by the rules, and lawyers should earn their keep. And I think what I wanted to throw on top of that is that still it's going to require a kind of commitment to a spirit. That student who didn't go to the book at 2 a.m., she knew there was something more than the rule that was stopping her. There was something pretty fundamental about her commitment to a certain set of values. So I'm not dismissing the adherence to the rules. Very, very important. But I hope there's more, and I'm worried today about the more. As a former professor, the students who are here, you better watch it, because in the law school they have this stuff called cold calls. And I said, I know what you guys are thinking of something, and I'm going to get it out of you here. But I won't put you on the spot yet. So, yeah.
To what do you attribute the rise of this current leadership of our country?
Yeah.
And the support? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, it beats the hell out of me. I just, I mean, in all seriousness, I really struggle sometimes. I just, I can't sometimes follow the, I would have long ago thought we would have resolved some of these questions, but the questions just get more, this probably seems like it's off the point, but it may be on the point. So I have a financial advisor I've been working with for the last 10 years. And he and I have a very good relationship. And we don't talk politics. We talk, what's your retirement portfolio looking like? And he said the last time we met, it was about a month ago, he said, you and I have talked, and we've gone through, the financial crisis, we've gone through pandemic, we've gone through COVID. And each time we remind ourselves that it's not different this time when it comes to finances and the economy and all of that. Things kind of go through cycles and they go up and down and everything. He said, I got nothing for you this time. He said, I have no idea what's going on. I think this time is different. And so I'm sympathetic. I wish I had an answer for you. And I just see some patterns that I've never seen before. Some declarations of why people are doing the things that they're doing that I just can't interpret in sort of the normal scheme of politics. And so the best I can offer is deep sympathy and mutual confusion. I just, but it is the thing that causes me to say, how do I deal with the confusion? And I think I try to, as I tried to say, I go back to some touchstones. George Washington apologized at the end of his time. Thomas Jefferson said, I'm going to screw this up. We know that that's the case, and we try to permit our leaders a certain degree of grace if we think they're acting in our own interest. And it's just a time right now when I think that's very problematic. Ben, you were...
There was a President Dugganell that quite often used to sit up in his office looking at the chapel and saying, please, heavens, don't let me screw this up.
Right.
I think
Yes. One of my more eloquent quotes.
we're talking about rules, and it makes me just leap straight to the difference between a ruler and a leader.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of fundamentally where we are right now. We have, rather than rule of law and principle, we have rule of whim by a man.
Mm.
The missing ingredient that you didn't mention, but I think is really important to incorporate into this, not all the values such as trust and humility, but the thing, this magic thing called courage.
Mm.
I was really quite stunned that Pence got the JFK award a couple of days ago.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just comment on how you think the role of courage and political leadership plays into the concepts that you described in trust and humility? It seems to me that courage is the third leg of the stool.
Yeah, and some of you know some other examples of courage that strike close to home in this day and age. But let me a couple of points. So when Melissa and I were talking about this originally, one of the points that I thought I might incorporate is a distinction that says there is something between a difference between leadership and the exercise of power. That often leadership involves the exercise of power, but often the exercise of power doesn't involve leadership. And what is it that kind of distinguishes that? There's an author, James McGregor Burns, who wrote a book in 1978 called Leadership, and he was attempting to establish leadership studies as an academic discipline. That didn't go too well, but it was a very thoughtful book. But one of the points that he was trying to make is we can find a lot of examples of how people use power, but not in all cases could those instances be considered leadership. And what would distinguish that is the purpose for which the thing was being done. And he tried in a very kind of idealistic way to say, the leadership distinction from the use of power is when leadership is being used for the benefit of those who are being led. And it may involve the use of power, but it's the purpose that is involved with that. On the courage thing, isn't it interesting that what we used to think of as standard ways of acting in the political world are now considered to be courageous? And again, this is a W&L connection story, so you'll forgive me. Many of you know that I'm very good friends with a man named Judge Michael Ludig. And Michael Ludig was an appeals judge, very conservative, almost a conservative icon to many kind of old-line conservatives. He was the one who actually advised Mike Pence on his constitutional role on January 6, 2021. The reason that he became so energized and so involved after that was because of what he saw the Republican Party did to Liz Cheney. And he knew Liz Cheney very, very well. And he said, that to me is the Rubicon that's been crossed. When doing what is right is perceived to be something courageous or exceptional. And so I think, maybe the comment, not necessarily an answer, is that it is telling that we've come to the point where simply doing what is right is this extraordinary act of courage. I don't know how to. I wish I could see more examples of it, but I don't. Let's see. We have probably time for one or two more. I know. Yes.
So, given ideological views and how it defies the logic of common sense, Right. How do we ensure that within our discourse we maintain trust and honesty to make sure that we can still have a civilized conversation?
Yeah.
What roles do leadership plays, irrespective of power, to maintain that balance?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of virtue and strength that comes from seeing what leaders say and what they do. It sends signals about what is appropriate and what is not to the rest. Imperfect signals, to be sure, but it shapes the dialogue that we have and how we think about things. One of the things, and afterwards, maybe if the students want to stay, I'd love to hear their thoughts on this. That, I had that one line in there about many of us find ourselves drifting to the sidelines and watching as spectators in this kind of performative politics thing. And the analogy I've often thought of is this high-intensity ping pong match where someone on one side just slams it, and then the person on the other side backs up and just slams it back, and by the time the point's resolved, one is at one end of the room and the other's at the other end of the room. And a lot of us are just watching this, saying, what the hell? And not seeing ourselves in that. And so I think it does get to that point where it kind of exacerbates itself and kind of feeds on itself. One other thing I left out of the talk, so you all can leave at the assigned time, is another thinker that I've gone back to a lot is Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America in the 1830s. And he had this wonderful observation that individualism was the cornerstone of American democracy. But taken to an extreme, it could also be its downfall. And what was the remedy for that, he said? And he said he looked around, and Americans tend to join. They join associations. They're in churches. They didn't have chambers of commerce at that time. They didn't have little leagues or bowling leagues or that kind of thing. But it was that kind of thing. Americans were always involved in their community, not for political reasons, but to have a library built or to erect a statue. I mean, it was just whatever the civic thing was. And he said what he noticed was that they do that at first out of calculation. They think there's something to benefit from them. When I started coaching T-ball here for RARO, it was because I was sure that my 6-year-old son was going to be a shortstop for the New York. I was absolutely sure. It was calculation. But after years of coaching there and coaching alongside other parents who were very, very different from us, what de Tocqueville said is calculation becomes instinct. And Melissa in her introduction mentioned that term habits of the heart, that at first we join out of calculation, but then it becomes instinct. And our self-interest moves from self-interest to self-interest rightly understood, which is that our well-being depends upon the well-being of those around us. We come to that realization. And I think that is weakened in our current situation. Melissa, I'm watching our time, and I know some of you have class, and some of you are out of, there's that old Far Side cartoon where there's a student sitting there saying, may I be excused, my brain is full. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. You filled not only our brains, but our hearts. And I think you would be open to a little more interaction
Sure.
or
I'm gonna hang around.
communication with some students and anybody else who might
Right.
want to pull on your sleeve. Thank you.